and I would like to introduce the speaker now. So we have Chinedu Chukwudinma, who's a member of West London SWP. He also has a Master's in African Study at SOAS. So without further ado.
Comrades, 1968 is the year the whole world caught fire. If you went to Asia, you could see the Vietnamese people fighting a bloody war against American imperialism. If you went to France, the students and workers had united against their government. And in America, you had the Black Power movement, the urban riots, and the Black Panthers. And if you went to Jamaica in the 1960s, you could see some of the most fantastic and extraordinary agitation around the question of Black Power as well. And this agitation was carried out by young people fighting against police brutality or by the emergent Rastafari movement. But in 1968, in Jamaica, it's a young history professor of 26 years old that will become the most important spokesperson of the Black Power movement. And this person is, of course, Walter Rodney. Now, Walter Rodney was not from Jamaica, he was from Guyana. But he knew Jamaican society very well because he had studied there in his university years. And Rodney had a PhD from SOAS in African history, and he had lived in Tanzania for a year. But in Jamaica, Rodney will show that he's very different from most academics at the university, in the sense that he doesn't sit in his ivory tower, but he's someone who always seeks to go down to the masses and interact with the masses. Because he believed that it's the masses that made history, and the role of the intellectual was to help them in their struggle. So one day you could find Walter Rodney speaking to a crowd of 300 students on campus, and the next day you could see him in the ghettos of Kingston speaking to a crowd of unemployed young people and Rastafarians. And it's through Walter Rodney's speeches on Jamaican politics, on African history, that we get a sense of why Black Power was a relevant slogan in the Caribbean and what were the objectives of the Black Power movement. And these are in Walter Rodney's book, Grounding with My Brothers. For Rodney, the first objective of Black Power is to break with imperialism. You see, Jamaica had been a slave colony of Britain, and then a colony of Britain until 1962. But after independence, nothing had changed for the majority. If you want, the mines were in the control of American and Canadian companies, and the sugar plantations were in the control of British companies. And these foreign companies paid terrible wages to their workers. And if you went to the countryside, you would see the closing down of these sugar estates. And that forced millions of people to migrate to the cities like Kingston and fill the ranks of the unemployed. And the Jamaican Labour Party, which was in power at the time, had no solution to this problem but to attract more foreign investment, more foreign companies, who paid terrible wages to their workers, by the way. And another thing, race in Jamaica was very much an economic category. And Rodney says that 95% of the Jamaican population was Black African. But if you look at the Jamaican government, if you look at the Jamaican ruling classes, you would see an overrepresentation of people who are European, Chinese, Syrians. And these people were the middlemen under the colonial system. And so, for Rodney, the second objective of Black Power is that the Black masses must assume political and economic power in the islands of the Caribbean. And Rodney spends a lot of time debunking the myth that is spread by the Jamaican ruling classes that Jamaica is a harmonious, peaceful, multiracial society. And he attacks the national motto, which says, one people out of many. And he says that this motto denies the Black masses of any power or any influence over society. And Rodney points out to the struggles of the Rastafarians or the Black nationalist organization, to how they agitated in society and forced the government to recognize Black power. For instance, in 1966, the Jamaican government was forced to invite Haile Selassie, which is the god of the Rastafarians, in order to appease the movement. And it did the contrary to what they expected and made the movement stronger. And the third objective of Black Power for Walter Rodney is that the Black masses must reshape the Caribbean in their own image. And many of Rodney's speeches emphasize the need for Black people to reconnect with their African heritage, with their identity that was wiped out through the slave trade and colonialism. And the video that I'm going to play here is one of the speeches that Rodney gave in 1968 to a group of Black Power students in San Francisco, but he could have given the same speech in Jamaica.
Let me draw your attention to something which white universities and white libraries practice. And this is a university community. Numerous universities lie around this land. Go into their libraries and check the Library of Congress card. Under Europe or Europeans, you will find all entries listed concerning the continent of Europe. You will also find entries listed about Europeans in East Africa, Europeans in North Africa, Europeans in Asia and Australia. Look under the Chinese, you will find entries listed not only for mainland China, but for Malaysia and for the Chinese in North America. But look on the Africa and the Africans, the only entries on the Africans relate to the continent itself. There are no entries on the Africans overseas. There is no such category. Africans who have been raped from the continent mysteriously disappear and become Negroes.
Now, I want to make clear that Rodney's Black Power isn't just a celebration of Africa. For Rodney, you're Black if you're a victim of racism and a victim of imperialism. And in the Caribbean, it concerned African people as much as it concerned Indian people. And what Rodney was trying to do in Jamaica, he was trying to tie the destinies of the Black masses with the people in the third world who were fighting against imperialism and colonialism. And I argue that Rodney was making an early case also for political blackness, when he says that a Pakistani man is just as dark as a Nigerian man when they go to the UK and they face job and housing discrimination. And this rings true today. And Rodney's activism in Jamaica, made the government very nervous. And eventually the government manages to ban Rodney from Jamaica. And when the people learned that Rodney was banned, the outcry was so great that thousands of students, of unemployed young people, protested and rioted for 2 days. And the event became known as the Rodney Riots. Sadly, they failed to bring him back. And that protest marked the end of Rodney's political activism in Jamaica. And just one last thing. The Black Power movement in Jamaica never developed any large-scale organization. And I argue it's because it was very difficult to build a cohesive organization simply around the fact of being Black. Because on the one hand, you had the Black elite that wanted more Black faces in higher places. But on the other hand, you had the working class and the unemployed young people who wanted a real overturn and class overturn of society. And after being banned from Jamaica, Rodney goes to Tanzania and he becomes a professor in African history at the University of Dar es Salaam from 1969 to 1974. And this was a logical choice for Rodney because Tanzania at the time was the absolute hub of African liberation. It was the kind of place where you could wine and dine with freedom fighters from Mozambique and go to a conference by Stokely Carmichael on Black Power in the same evening. And this is because Nyerere, Tanzania's first president, who you see here, expressed a strong commitment to fighting imperialism and also called himself a socialist. He wasn't really a socialist, but we'll get back to that later. And at the time, Rodney already saw himself as a Marxist. You see, when he was a student in London, he belonged to an informal study group that was taught by C.L.R. James, the author of Black Jacobins, and his wife Selma. And I always wondered what this study group would look like, because if you knew both characters, you would know that they had very dynamic but stubborn personalities. But in Africa, Rodney would try to use Marxist theory in order to strengthen anti-imperialist movements in the Third World. And he writes his masterpiece, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, in 1972. And in his book, Rodney is going against the racist Western intellectuals and institutions that blame Africans for the lack of development in Africa at the end of colonialism. And for having been to SOAS, I know that these people and institutions still exist today. But Rodney begins his study by showing that African societies had a vibrant and independent process of development before the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century. And if you want, he establishes the real African mode of production in Marxist terms, where he says that most African societies were communal ones, where land was collectively owned. But you also had larger and more complex feudal societies like in Ethiopia and the Congo. And learning about this African history was very powerful for me growing up, because when I was growing up, I remember the French president, Sarkozy at the time, who went to Africa, who went to Senegal and stood next to the Senegalese president and said, Africans have no history. He said that the African peasant has never gone into history. And you see, Rodney reassured me that the African peasant had done far more for the world than Sarkozy ever did for France. Rodney goes on to show in his book how capitalism, through the slave trade and through colonialism, interrupted this independent process of development of African societies. And just a reminder, the slave trade had terrible consequences for the African continent, because for more than 4 centuries, you had the most able young men and women who were kidnapped in their millions to go work in the Americas. And the slave traders were really good at creating wars on the continent by playing one people against another. And as Karl Marx pointed out, without African labor, there would be no cotton, and without cotton, there would be no modern industry. And this is what Rodney is trying to say. It's African labor that made the European ruling classes rich. And the same can be said for colonialism. Colonialism was a brutal system of mobilization of African labor, forced labor, in order to extract natural resources for the benefit of the European ruling classes. And what I like about Rodney is that he spends a lot of time in his book destroying the racist myth that colonialism did good for Africa. Think about Michael Gove, that crackhead who always glorifies the empire. Think about Gordon Brown, who said that Britain should stop apologizing for the empire. And you laugh, but this is what my teachers used to tell me when I was growing up. There used to be, hey, Chin, we know that colonialism was bad, but colonialism did some good. They built railways, they built healthcare. And Rodney gave me the counter arguments, especially when he says, guys, the railways weren't built so that Africans could go and visit their friends. All the train lines went from the interior of the country to the ports to ship goods to Europe. And on healthcare, Rodney gives the example of the Portuguese. The Portuguese spent 500 years on the African continent. And in 500 years, they weren't able to train a single doctor in Mozambique. That's the reality of colonialism. And what Rodney is trying to do in his book, he's trying to tell African intellectuals after colonialism that if you want to bring real development in Africa, if you want to bring a society that can eradicate poverty, where everybody is free to express their own abilities, you need to break with capitalism. Capitalism is the principal agent of African underdevelopment. And I argue that Walter Rodney's book was a real prophecy, because you see, it was written in 1972. And 10 years later, in 1980, most countries who followed the African path, who borrowed from the European and American banks, were bankrupt because of the global economic crisis. And that's when you get institutions of American capital like the IMF and the World Banks, and who come in and say, hey, look, guys, you have to repay the European and the American banks. That means you have to cut the funding on education. You have to cut the funding on healthcare. You have to cut the wages. You have to cut all the things that matter. And so if you want, the African capitalist dream in the 1980s turns into the African capitalist nightmare, where you got the spread of like wars and military coups on the continent. And Rodney doesn't say it explicitly in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, but he's really making a case for socialism. And in Tanzania, he's going to look at Tanzanian socialism very closely, and in the first instance, even come out in support of it. And he comes out in support of it, even though Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, said that he wasn't a Marxist, nor that he didn't understand any notion of class struggle. The class struggle didn't exist for him. What was Tanzanian socialism? Tanzanian socialism was called familyhood, ujamaa. And what the Tanzanian state was trying to do, it was trying to move peasants from individual plots of lands into collective farming. And the reason they were doing so is because they hoped to increase production to make Tanzania self-reliant in food. Because if your economy depended on the colonial cash crops, when the prices of these crops went down on the international market, peasants wouldn't have enough cash to buy food and feed their families. So that's why Walter Rodney saw this as progressive and even revolutionary. But you see, Rodney at the university was surrounded by Marxist students. And those Marxist students, they argued with him. They say, hey, what you saying? Nyerere's socialism is not socialism. It's socialism from above, or what we would call state capitalism. And why did they say that? They knew that Nyerere had crushed all independent working class organizations by 1964. He had crushed the trade unions. And they knew more often than not that the peasants were forced into these collective villages when they were supposed to be convinced. They also knew that the peasants had no control over production. They couldn't decide what to produce, how to produce it, and when to produce. And if you want, their whole life was in the hands of local bureaucrats. And these bureaucrats saw themselves as superior to the peasants because they came from that class that was educated under colonialism. And the Tanzanian state at the time, the Tanzanian bureaucracy, was under immense pressure to make the peasants work harder, to extract more grains, more surpluses for the peasants so that they can compete on the international market. Its survival as a nation depended on that. But in his final years in Tanzania, Rodney would become more critical of that bureaucratic socialism. And he starts to document the resistance of peasants to the process of collectivization. And more importantly, he starts to document the resistance of workers in the new nationalized factories. Because you see, in 1973, the Tanzanian state came out with a Charter of Workers' Rights. And it was to show that in the nationalized factories, the management would be much better than the management under colonialism. It wasn't, of course. But Rodney rejoices at the fact that workers agitated around this charter to get their rights implemented. Some workers wore the charter around their necks and went up to the management, harassing them, telling them that you haven't done this, you haven't done that, and you haven't done that. And Rodney likes even more that this agitation led to a series of strikes and occupations. And he comes to the conclusion, if you want, that this is fantastic. The workers have shown through their struggle that they can actually run the factories better than the management. And if you want, Rodney comes here to the core of Marxism, that the self-emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself. Socialism cannot be handed from above. It has to be fought for. And Rodney will become more and more hostile to the African elite at the time. But in 1974, Rodney decides to leave Tanzania and go back to Guyana to fight against the dictatorship of Fort Spurnham. And he leaves Tanzania because he wants to struggle in the place where he was born, where the people know him, and where he can speak the language of the people. And the video that I'm about to play shows the Guyana that Walter Rodney grew up in. It was a moment of unity between African and Indian workers in the struggle against British colonialism. And this was unusual because both communities were known to have been divided. And Rodney's parents actually belonged to the Marxist Party in the 1950s, which led this struggle. It was the Stalinist Party. And this movement really radicalized Rodney. And the video that I'm going to play, shows how dynamic the struggle against colonialism actually was. Oops. I like the drums. You can feel like things are changing. But the unity that was there in the 1950s broke down in the 1960s as the national liberation movement split across racial lines. And this split was partly due to the CIA's intervention in Guyanese politics, because America and Kennedy at the time were really paranoid that Guyana would become a second communist Cuba right beneath them. And so the party that won independence at the time was the party that had the best relationship with America. And the leader of that party, who you see here, Fort Spurnham, got the African support and made sure that the bureaucracy, that the state, was in control of the Afro-Guyanese elites. And this party called itself socialist in name, but all it did was nationalize the factories. And so if you want, the foreign bureaucrat replace the local bureaucrat replaced the foreign bureaucrat. And the opposition party that was led by this man, Chedi Jagan, was a lot more pro-Stalinist. That's why it was kept out of power. It talked about racial unity, but in practice only mobilized to get the support of the Indian community for free and fair elections. But these free and fair elections never came in Guyana because the dictatorship always rigged them. And so when Rodney comes back to Guyana, he finds a working class that is divided along racial lines. And he sees how the state of Fort Spurnham, plays one community against the other. For instance, they would send black policemen and black scabs to break up Indian workers on strike. And so what Rodney tries to do through his writings and speeches at the time is that he tries to understand the history of this divide between both communities, between the working class, and how this divide can be transcended in the present. And he comes to an understanding that the racism that you see in Guyana in the 1970s, the rise from the colonial era, from the plantation slave economy. Because you see, racism was the ideology of the white plantation slave owners. And it was the ideology that justified the enslavement of black people. But when black people won their freedom in 1838, they became wage laborers on the plantation. And as wage laborers, they fought for higher wages. And they also moved into the villages to escape the tyranny of the master. Because when you lived on what was called the nigger yard, the master could come and fetch you at any time. Could come and fetch you at 4 o'clock in the morning and make you go work. And so if you want, these freed slaves, they left the estate in order to go live in the villages to be able to sell their labor freely. And Rodney says that the British in the 19th century introduced indentured Indian laborers. And these Indian laborers, indentured laborers, were a cheap source of labor that was used to break the back of this growing black militancy. So if you want, the racism that was there in Guyana, racism in Guyana, was used in order to divide the Black and Indian communities, to intensify their competition over jobs, and to keep the wages as low as possible. And Rodney comes to the understanding that the Indian elite and the African elite today that runs Guyana, even though it's entirely non-white, it still has a class interest in maintaining these racial divisions. And he talks about the Indian landlord who grew rich not by exploiting Africans, but by exploiting his so-called fellow Indians. And this Indian landlord used to use racism against Blacks in order to hide the class differences between him and the people that he was exploiting. He used to say, listen, we're all Indians, we're all in this together against the Blacks who control the state, and vice versa. But Rodney shows that the Indian and the African working class have shown moments of solidarity in high points of struggle. And he traces the strikes and the different struggles where both communities fought together. And he said that these struggles were the biggest fears of every colonial governor, and they're the biggest fear of the government today. And so Rodney joins and builds an organization that could overcome these racial divisions and also make a case for overthrowing the dictatorship. And this organization that he builds is called the Working People's Alliance. It was a coalition of different African and Indian Marxist organizations. And Rodney and his comrades, they really love going into the mining communities or in the sugar working communities and agitating and making this case for unity against the government. This is what Rodney loved doing. He loved going in and talking to the workers, giving courses on the Russian Revolution or giving courses on Marxist political economy. And Rodney and his organization did extraordinary things. I mean, they managed to get Black workers to donate money to support Indian workers who had gone on strike. They managed to get different groups who were against the dictatorship to launch a campaign for democracy. And in 1979 in Guyana was a real explosive year because you had what was called the Civil Rebellion. It means that you had a wave of mass protest and mass strikes against the government. And the most active group in these strikes were the Black miners and the Black lower civil servants. And on top of that, you had the wave of revolutions in Latin America and in the Caribbean, like in Grenada. And so the debate at the time was whether revolution was going to come to Guyana. And the government of Forbes Burnham starts to get really nervous. And they become even more nervous when they hear that Indian workers are organizing a solidarity strike to join the Africans. They fear that the system is going to stop. And they blame Rodney and his organization for it and even tried to arrest him several times. But of course, Rodney could not be silenced. Because Rodney and his organization really strived in this environment of the civil rebellions. Just to give you an example, the public meetings that they organized in the countryside would turn into spontaneous marches against the dictatorship. And in the city, they once pulled a rally of like 8,000 people, which was amazing. And Rodney's speeches at those rallies could actually break the fear that was around the dictatorship. Because in Guyana, people were really afraid. I mean, if you spoke out in your workplace against the dictatorship, you could lose your job straight away. And here you have Rodney, who comes here all fresh and who starts to make fun of the dictatorship. He says, hey, this guy is not a man. Let's call him King Kong. Don't try that against Boris Johnson because it's racist. But you get what I'm saying. Rodney used to crack people up. And more importantly, he used to say to the working class that it's you, the workers, it's you who make everything in society. Therefore, it's you who are the source of power and wealth of the dictatorship. And if you stop your work, if you go on strike, well, the dictatorship can crumble. However, in the year 1980, the civil rebellion went down. There was less mass protest and less strike. and the government's repression gained the upper hand. They called in, the trade union bureaucracy, obviously, to betray to take a concession, and so the strike went down. And also they stepped up their repression against different WPA activists. And these were very difficult times for Rodney and his comrades. Rodney had to escape from house to house to avoid police harassment. Some of his closest friends had been killed in different protests. And you had the feeling that the leadership of its organization could no longer be protected by the mass movement. They were very vulnerable. And I got a sense that Rodney and his comrades were becoming more and more impatient. They were trying to find ways to revive the mass movement out of fear that it would be lost forever. And this meant taking enormous risk. One of the leaders of his organization would say, "We found ourselves in dodgy places doing dodgy things." And one of the dodgy things that they were doing, for instance, they were trying to buy weapons in different places or equipment to organize their self-defense and also prepare for the next insurrection. And it's these tactics, if you want, that led to Rodney's death on the 13th of June, 1980. On that day, Rodney was with his brother, and he went to buy a walkie-talkie from an ex-soldier who was actually paid by the government. And when he activated the device, it blew up in his face. Yeah, now I'm going to spend a few of the minutes that I have playing a video of the funeral of Walter Rodney, because it was the biggest funeral that Guyana has ever seen at the time. I mean, his funeral was a real protest. 35,000 people attended Rodney's funeral. And the Guyanese working class realized that they had lost somebody special. They had lost their most brightest and dedicated leaders. And after Rodney died, his party continued, and they still have very good activists today. But the problem was, because of the repression and also of the low struggle, they made a turn into electoral politics. They chose reform over revolution. And to be honest, they did very badly in elections. They never got more than 2%. That's because the racial divide in Guyana is still very strong. So even after those free elections happened in Guyana, they never did very well. And I also argue is that you can't make a case for racial unity through the ballot box. Think about it for a second. Going to the ballot box is a very individual act. And you can't expect people who have been shaped by years of capitalism, of racism, to suddenly come out and say, oh, I'm going to make the right decision. And so this is why it's important to come back to what Rodney always argued. Rodney always argued that racial unity can be achieved through the struggle. It's through the struggle in the streets and the workplaces that people's ideas change en masse and change the fastest. And it's through the struggle that the Indian and the African working class will realize that they have a common interest in getting rid of their exploiters. And that's why it's important for revolutionaries to organize in the streets and in the workplaces, because that's where the power of the working people lie. And that's the legacy of Walter Rodney. And it's our duty as revolutionaries today to make sure that his legacy continues.